Attackers are only getting more proficient, so how can you proactively adapt your cybersecurity strategy? Core Security by Fortra helps you uncover and prioritize the risks that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Core Impact is a penetration testing tool that safely finds and exploits vulnerabilities using the same techniques as attackers. You can conduct advanced pen tests with ease using certified exploits and automation. Take your engagements further by pairing with our red teaming tools from Cobalt Strike and Outflank. Learn more at www.securityweekly.com/core security. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. All right, and for this interview, we are talking to Josh Corman, who joins us today to talk about the White House's recently released National Cybersecurity Strategy. Josh is one of the most mission-oriented cybersecurity folks I know. He co-founded Rugged Software and I Am the Cavalry, both massive security initiatives to educate and build security awareness for a world that's increasingly dependent on digital infrastructure. He has served as the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council, chief strategist for the CISO COVID Task Force, was an industry analyst, held some vendor roles as well, which, you know, are probably the least interesting of all the stuff that Josh has done. But just so you know, he's done that stuff as well. Currently the VP of Cyber Safety Strategy at Clarity. Good friend and one of the rare folks I can rely on to really tell me what he thinks, not just what he thinks I want to hear. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thank you for having me on.
And I think that context is important for the discussion we're going to have today because you actually had a hand in putting together this strategy, correct?
Yeah, it's been lots of people contributed, but I was already motivated. I've helped on the last few of these, but extra motivated because of the CISO COVID Task Force. We learned a lot about the strengths and weaknesses and how we approach critical infrastructure and the broken incentives. So I had a lot to do with 2.5 of the 5 pillars or so. So could probably give context you wouldn't see just from reading it.
Right. And, you know, honestly, I'm going to ask you where the best place to start is here, because I think this is one of the rare cases where you probably have a better idea how to structure this conversation than I do. That's usually my job as the host, but embarrassingly, I'm going to ask for some help here.
Maybe we could start with what you think is the most controversial in there.
Most controversial? It's probably where I was going to start anyhow. Catherine, what about you? What do you think?
Well, I think it's definitely around software liability, right?
Yeah, of course. So tiny bit of context. In fact, when I was doing my prep with Adrian a little bit, we actually have to start a little earlier, but I'll start where you're asking me to, and we can back up and then jump forward. In theory, each White House will put out a strategy on cybersecurity, which is to telegraph their priorities. And some people think these don't mean anything. It's just an obligation. There's nothing really controversial or meaningful there. You can generally ignore them. I don't think that's the case here. At a minimum, it's meant to set a tone for where the White House and the executive branch are going to emphasize things while they're in power. It usually tees up what they're going to ask Congress to do or encourage Congress to do in the legislative branch. People forget this as well, but sometimes it's telegraphing to the judiciary branch. If they have court cases come up, this is our current thinking and our current interpretation of the world. So they're never really meaningless and they're never really complete, but this one's got some really big shifts in it that if you hadn't paid attention, you might miss. So I can call them out for us and try to discuss. But generally speaking, when these come out, it's not how to do something. It's just saying these are the things we think are important. It's also followed by implementation strategies. Sometimes they're summarizing things they already started and you heard about. Sometimes they're telegraphing something really new and really bold. So without doing a civics lesson on everything, this year had 5 pillars. First one was called Defending Critical Infrastructure. Second was called Disrupt and Dismantle Threat Actors. Third was Shaping Market Forces to Drive Security and Resilience. Fourth was Investment in a Resilient Future. And fifth was forging international partnerships. For me, for someone who cares about where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, I think the most critical ones, the ones I focused most of my attention on, were pillars 1 and 3. So in a lot of these strategies, they talk about defending federal agencies and federal governments and federal IT. This one says essentially critical infrastructure is the most critical. Why? Well, if you squint, while I was in CISA running the CISA Code Task Force, even outside of healthcare, hyperconnectivity and more aggressive adversaries had proof of the ability to disrupt the water you drink, the food you put on your table, oil and gas pipelines that fuel our cars, homes, and supply chains, the schools your kids go to, municipalities who run towns and cities, federal agencies, and even timely access to patient care. And last May, I testified about the first proof of loss of life from ransom attacks in hospitals. So once you start to see instability and unresilient performance of basic human needs like water, food, shelter, safety, access to patient care, the public part of the public-private partnership says we have a role to play. You can't just do what's right for your company. We have to do what's right for public safety and national security. So it's not typical to see such a full-throated focus on critical infrastructure as they did with Pillar 1. I'll pause, then I'll get to the really controversial one of Pillar 3. But anything so far?
One of the things I liked about this, and where I really heard your voice, Josh, is in the language. You bring. I've noticed you bring a lot of like safety and healthcare related terminology to this, which I think really kind of transforms, the focus here. Especially as the concerns about security shift into those spaces, where there is real concern about it impacting, like you say, flesh and blood.
Yeah. So the real controversial one is Pillar 3, which is shaping market forces. I mean, if I had to use casual language and maybe even flippant language, Pillar 1 is critical infrastructure is the most critical thing for this administration. Pillar 2 is just take the fight back to the adversaries. A lot of that's probably saber rattling. We only have certain laws and authorities, and that's complicated. They're usually maximizing those. Pillar 3 is the brand new stuff, which is essentially, my own words, saying, hey, the public-private partnership usually means the private sector says, please don't regulate us. We don't want to be regulated. And the government says, okay. So it's usually been a very dominant voice of industry and trade associations and lobbyists. And the government tries not to use the heavy-handed government to stifle innovation, et cetera, et cetera. But what they're saying here is that what we're doing is not working and it's not balanced. So there needs to be a rebalance. And some of the jargon you'll hear from Chris Inglis before he retired, or now Kemba, is that free market forces can only take you so far. There is a time and a place to use the power of government to do what's right for everyone instead of just right for one company at a time. And we're going to use that power. We're going to use a light touch, but no lighter than is required. And essentially, if you've heard Ann Neuberger from the White House National Cybersecurity Council speaking, or any of these folks, they're saying, look, where we have existing regulatory authorities across these 16 critical infrastructure sectors, often they are underutilized or even unutilized. So where we have authorities, we're going to maximize the use of those authorities, better late than never. Where we lack authorities, we're asking Congress to aggressively grant us new authorities to regulate at least minimum cybersecurity resilience hygiene for these critical infrastructure sectors. And since often the liability or the harm and the cost and the burden is squarely on the shoulders of teenagers or owners and operators of rural hospitals and water facilities, as opposed to the suppliers who sell them unsupported end-of-life software or hard-coded passwords or don't support MFA, is that they want a rebalancing to shift some of the cost burden on those in the best position to absorb and avoid that risk. So that means they want to look at the supply chain selling into critical infrastructure. So maybe medical devices probably shouldn't have Windows XP brand new today that's end of life. So they're introducing the concept of we probably need to finally grapple with and introduce software liability for final goods assemblers with safe harbor. But this one's causing severe panic and hot takes and whatnot in industry. But what they're going to do is use the power they have now more than they have, even within one day. The Environmental Protection Agency put out some initial regulatory expectations for all water and wastewater, similar with airports and others. And you may recall after Colonial, the White House NSC had already done this with pipelines. They asked TSA to aggressively come up with minimum hygiene expectations for oil and gas pipelines.
And
so
what can we
expect
that safe? You just mentioned safe harbor, right? What can we expect it to look like? You have any idea? Do we know yet?
I have some ideas. Again, this is the strategy document. I could pontificate. I could tell you what I would like to see and prefer. I can point you to some things that I and others have talked about for many, many years in public about what that could look like. And maybe we should do a little pontification. But I think most of the hot takes you've seen, some of them are, genuine concerns. Some of them are a little, if not quite off base on Pillar 3, but that's usually where the discussion is. But before you get into the controversy, I guess, there's a tiny piece of Pillar 4 that I think is pretty important. Pillar 4 is kind of like the grab bag of a lot of important things that didn't have a home. It's like the island of misfit toys a little bit. And there's a mix of some good things in there and some
maybe we should just name them. So Pillar 4 is invest in a resilient future, right?
Yeah. And the last one's about strengthening international partnerships. But the most meat is critical infrastructure focus of 1 and shaping incentives. One of the things we've said on this podcast before, at least with the Paul show, is we actually know how to eliminate SQL injection. We know how to make it extinct, but we haven't. And so it's not a technical gap, it's an incentive gap. And
right.
I think, the White House is, and even Congress, because I told you this started before the White House paper, but Congress is showing bipartisan support, and the White House is aligned with them that, okay, no, you can't just do voluntary. NIST cybersecurity framework came out about a decade ago to prevent regulation. But a decade later, very, very, very few people are adopting it in critical infrastructure. So they're going to have to do something to keep the trust of the public.
So the question that Pillar 3 kind of really keeps lingering in the back of my head is like you're talking about the stakeholders most capable of taking action, to quote it here, should have responsibility. But what are the chances that we can enforce this and get this right when the people most likely to bear the cost, or that should be bearing the cost, also have the greatest ability to lobby lawmakers?
Yeah. Well, maybe this is the best part to jump back, and then I'm not dodging the safe harbor question. We can pontificate. I'm just not speaking formally for the White House or for Congress, because that's going to have to go through Congress or the courts. Right. And my money's on the courts, by the way. Everyone's focused on Congress, but my money's on the courts. So in parallel with this, as proof, as a canary in the coal mine, I think my first time briefing Congress ever was first week of January in 2014. And I basically outlined my deep concern over medical device cybersecurity and software transparency. So it was a mixture of software bill of materials and what's the minimum seatbelt laws we should have for medical devices. I hadn't even built a trust relationship with Suzanne Schwartz yet at FDA. But almost 9 years to the day, on December 22nd or 23rd, while I was on my honeymoon, the Patch Act got included in the Omnibus Appropriations Bill and passed it into law of the land. And what's in the Patch Act is statutory authority in the law to give the FDA mandatory minimum cyber hygiene enforcement for all medical devices. And it includes things like you have to be patchable and patch in a timely manner. You have to have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program to work with good faith researchers and hackers. You have to have a machine-generated, machine-readable software bill of materials as part of your submission, threat modeling, things like that. So that's an example where if you want to bring a medical device to market or an updated medical device through a 510K, you have to do these things now. They're not optional because there's life safety implications. So to your point about lobbyists, this was why I knew we were in a new place. I did testify last May to the Senate Help Committee, which is Healthcare, Education, Labor, and Pensions, about the first proof of loss of life. They were trying to decide if they had enough political will to pick this fight with the lobbyists and the trade associations for medical devices. And, you can go watch it and watch my statement or the cross-examinations. But ultimately, what I came to learn is that the Republican senator from Louisiana, a physician himself, fought tooth and nail against the lobbyists all the way to the last minute, against a lot of money, and got this through. It had already passed the House earlier in the year. Didn't look like it was going to pass the Senate, but he got it in. And to me, this was the warning shot that I think this was the first time that people said, yes, lobbyists don't want this. Yes, private sector is trying to shirk their responsibility. And we have a job to do for public safety. That's our role. So this newfound political will, to me, is not just on the medical stuff. You've seen similar bipartisan support for water and wastewater, for small, medium, or rural electricity for K through 12 schools. It's kind of one of those things where they put it off as long as they can, and they're going to at least try to crawl, walk, run. So yes, there's big lobbyists, and at least Congress told them no on the Patch Act.
So all these years later, there was just a recent announcement, obviously, with the FDA. They are now, I think it's as of yesterday, I looking at my calendar, the FDA can now refuse medical device submissions for any kind of cybersecurity misalignment or failure to meet those requirements. So one, how gratifying is it to you? And two, what does this mean in all practicality for other IoT unmanaged device type assets that are coming to market?
Those are different questions. It was very gratifying. I bought an extra bottle of champagne on my honeymoon when we learned. It's actually the second law we've helped with to pass. But this one I believe more in. I think Suzanne at FDA absolutely intends to enforce this. The first one we passed was the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, and it hasn't had rulemaking yet, even though it passed more than 2 years ago. Although this White House strategy is asking them to finally do the rulemaking on that. So yes, very gratifying. It was hacker informed. Lots and lots of people and trust have contributed to that overall thinking. But it's also depressing that it took 9 years to say, let's finally have mandatory minimums. This is essentially the seatbelt laws for medical devices. And there were attempts to legislate minimum cybersecurity before the NIST cybersecurity framework. The NIST cybersecurity framework was a stalling action in part. I mean, of course, it's great and everybody uses it, but part of the way the Chamber of Commerce and the trade associations framed it was, let's buy some time, let's do some voluntary stuff. We don't need regulation. But there's been a bunch of Office of the Inspector General reports and other things showing incredibly low adoption rates of that voluntary framework, especially in critical infrastructure. So while you saw that law pass as an example, while the National Cybersecurity Strategy was published recently, and we're talking about it now, this dovetails with other things you might have heard of as well. Like the White House had given, when I was at CISA, in fact, I don't think Adrian even knew I was at CISA, but while we were protecting hospitals and the vaccine supply chains, we found about 85% of the targets had no single cybersecurity person on staff, zero. So 85% of hospitals, many of these vaccine suppliers were completely prone. They had cyber physical systems reachable on Shodan with hard-coded passwords, unsupported operating systems. So I said, guys, stop just uttering best practices. You're like Marie Antoinette saying, if they have no bread, just let them eat cake. Like, this is ridiculous. They can't just do zero trust or just do best practices. So I pushed something pretty hard that you can still see today called CISA.gov bad practices. And these were the 2, and now it's 3 most dangerous practices in critical infrastructure. For example, the use of end-of-life unsupported operating systems in service of critical infrastructure and national critical functions is dangerous. Same thing for hard-coded, well-known maintenance default passwords. And then a similar one was added later. But these things were meant to meet people where they are and identify and buy down risk. The White House really liked that. And they said, okay, the NIST cybersecurity framework's 400 pages, lots of controls. But if you're not doing anything yet, where do you start? So they tasked CISA with something they published last fall called the Cyber Performance Goals. They're not really performance goals, but they're good in that they are the 39 starting point controls of that overall 400-page document. So think in a crawl, walk, run, this is the crawl stage. So if bad practices are maybe the definition of negligence for an operator, then these CPGs are supposed to be cross-sector, generic, baseline practices that people should do immediately. And if you really squint between the CPGs, and the White House is saying in Pillar 1, they want each of the sector-specific risk management agencies to start with the CPGs and then make fit-for-purpose sector-specific adjustments for those minimum hygiene. So while the FDA was ahead of the curve with the Patch Act and, yes, announced their rulings on how to enforce that yesterday, they said they're going to give a grace period until October 1st, technically. But yeah, pretty soon you won't be able to submit crappy documentation or crappy cybersecurity. They have a head start. Within a day of this publishing, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency for water and wastewater, theirs is not a requirement to do all the controls, but their first move, directed by the White House, was, hey, water and wastewater, on your annual sanitation survey, please answer this survey. And if you look at the survey questions, it's the 39 cyber performance goals. So they want to get an assessment of how is the water situation across the 50 states and territories against
and that's within a day of the cybersecurity strategy getting published, just to clarify, because you mentioned a couple documents there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's several, I think if the White House gets their way, there's the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Each one has their own regulators. Some regulate the owners and operators of the infrastructure and the service delivery. Some regulate the devices that go into those, like the FDA. So in the case of healthcare and public health, FDA's got a head start with the Patch Act, but there's really no minimum cyber hygiene at all for hospitals. There's HIPAA rules for patient data. But as I said during my task force for Congress in 2017, we have more incentive to have a corpse with their privacy intact than to protect patient care. So the only laws and regulations we have on hospital cyber safety and resilience is around the confidentiality of data. And in kind, on the backs of the Patch Act, Senator Warner, who's pretty tech savvy, he's planning several rounds of legislation after a white paper he published in December called Cybersecurity is Patient Safety. There's a huge shift now that while we have regulated patient data, we have done nothing for patient safety. Similarly, Robin Kelly of Illinois in the House, she has legislation that she wants to make minimum standards for the hospitals as well, but understands that small, medium rurals don't have enough money or resources to meet those standards. So she's also giving stimulus packages to say, here's money if you're under this certain bed count, where we will help you achieve those minimums. So we're in a very different place. The mandatory minimums around CPGs are aimed at the owners and operators. The liability comments and things like the Patch Act are aimed at the suppliers who sell into those owners and operators. So how much of this will get executed and in which order is going to be based on how strong-willed the lobbyists are or how strong-willed each of the sector risk management agencies are. But the guidance from the White House is really focused not on all critical infrastructure, but on the most time-sensitive, latency-sensitive infrastructure that could lead to mass casualties or a crisis of the confidence of public. Think bottom of Maslow's hierarchy: water, healthcare, electricity, energy. Those things are getting the first and hardest set of focus, not consumer electronics.
Talking about you mentioned stimulus for helping hospitals who obviously can't afford to spend all that money on cybersecurity because they probably don't have unlimited budget to even help all the patients that they have. One thing I was surprised not to see in the cybersecurity strategy, but maybe it's because that's not where it goes, right? Like I don't know that much about how the White House works. I'm not even American, right? That being said, I'll be impacted by this no matter what, because no, I'm not. Surprisingly,
that's why he's on this call, so he can ask all the uncomfortable questions since he's Canadian.
Oh yeah, exactly. No, I'm just wondering, shouldn't there be more of a suggestion of almost like a stimulus package for important open source software? One thing that definitely struck me was there's almost no mention of open source in the entire strategy, right? Like if you do a find in page, open source, well, of course, there's like 16 ways of writing it with a space, a hyphen, no space, whatever, but you'll find very little mention of it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I did several table reads. They don't ship this around. It would leak instantaneously if they did. So you have to go in person, which makes it hard when you don't live in DC. But there were several versions of this, and it was fascinating for me to see which versions got stripped down to nearly nothing and which ones held their ground pretty well. But there was a lot of discussion around open source, software supply chains, et cetera. And while I think you're right, the final versions didn't quite use the language that you are. There are vestiges of this in different spots. Like, for example, when they talk about shaping market forces and shifting the burden to those in the best position to identify and buy down risk, they specifically say not the owners and operators and not free open source projects, right? So some people freaked out.
Right. That's one of the like 2 or 3 mentions of open source there, which is, let's make sure that the 2 people maintaining this GitHub project don't end up responsible for the $18 million breach, right? Which I think makes sense, but I just didn't see anything around improving the security of open source in general.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The only solace I can give you right now in a hurry is a couple things. They do refer to doubling down on software bill of materials in one of the pillars. I want to say it was pillar 1. And the executive order 14028, which came out in spring of 2021, I want to say. It's the final enforcement for many of those actions. That's for federal procurement and acquisition. So see the, not that you have this in front of you, but I have my little cheat sheet. One of the, it's section 3.5. So pillar 3, section 5 says leverage federal procurement to improve accountability. So just like executive order 14028 said, this was the president's response to things like SolarWinds, but not exclusively SolarWinds. This is where they said, hey, we should define what critical infrastructure and software looks like. We should use the power of the federal government's purchasing to make sure everything we buy is trustworthy and transparent. One of my contributions to that was the sentence of, in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. So that was the section that kind of said, hey,
I could have guessed that was your sentence when I read it. So what that could turn into is, for example, if we had like a hard bleed situation and there's all this software that includes OpenSSL, well, then the government could go ahead and use their spending power to say, okay, let's go fix OpenSSL, for example.
Yeah, I'm doing a bad job getting to it, but so part of what happened so A, they're going to continue to invest on top of Executive Order 14028, which had a lot of open source stuff in it. B, several side projects happened. Congress introduced a bill late last year for open source funding and prioritization, especially in critical infrastructure. Jack Cable, if you know him, he's very tech literate. He was a congressional tech fellow on that staff. Now he's back over at CISA. CISA is really ramping up some of their projects, and some of these are public and some of them are less public, but there are increasing attempts to understand which open source packages are most dependent upon, not just the federal government, but in critical infrastructure. Because once we have knowledge of prevalence and dependence, then part of the argument here, and the White House has already held several meetings with open source thought leaders and contributors, is how do we make sure that we're not just taking advantage of these free resources, but we're maybe investing in them. And in some cases, specifically the one you mentioned, I keep reminding them for OpenSSL, it's this huge, monolith kitchen sink project with tons of complexity and features and sub-features. And a lot of people might use that entire project just for random number generation, but they might get the attack surface of a lot more. So in some cases, if we can't have high assurance implementations of TLS, for example, perhaps we should be funding and investing in, or encouraging and incentivizing investment in maybe smaller STRAC, more modular, more high assurance implementations of some of these libraries. Because if you're only as strong as your weakest link, and as we discussed on the webinar we just did together, that old XKCD comic of like the stack of blocks in this tiny little open source project with one guy maintaining it could make the entire system fall down. We're really blind to that. And my passion and mission on SBOM for the last decade, even though some of our friends hate it, is, you cannot manage it if you don't know you have it. And we are really blind to what open source is pervading, which places and which ones are unsupported or end of life or have known exploited vulnerabilities in it. And I think this is a multi-pronged approach, and I think in the implementation you'll see more, but there's quite a few projects that are trying to better understand the prevalence and dependence on certain open source so that we can either fund them correctly or mitigate those risks or have better transparency and line of sight for those risks.
So because we don't see that in the strategy doesn't mean it's not happening. It's just happening in different places.
Yeah, I do think it could have more cohesion because I'm aware of several, and whenever I compare notes to someone else, they're aware of a few that I didn't know about. But the good news is they're looking at it, and I do think as a byproduct of this software liability discussion, it's going to come up a lot more that somewhere between 85 and 95% of closed source code is open source code, and you and I known that for a long time, but very very few people have really reckoned with that.
Yeah, it's one of those things like once you start telling somebody like how fragile a lot of this is, like it's it's scary, and it's hard to, well, and speaking of fragile, something I wanted to ask here, which is unrelated, more zoomed out, is how fragile this whole thing is, with the label White House on it. Obviously it's kicking off and related to some other projects going on, that have sounds like more bipartisan support. But when the White House, the next change in the White House happens, how fragile is all this, and how likely is disruption to some of the good work going on? I don't really have a sense personally for how much bipartisan support there is for a lot of the stuff in here.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because I haven't heard someone ask that before, but it might be in the back of people's minds. Two things I'll answer, at least. We'll see what happens when my lips start flapping. One of them is a lot of the people. So ONCD is the Office of the National Cyber Director. It's a brand new part passed into law by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission people like Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, who co-founded the Cyber Caucus. He's done now, and Catco is his Republican partner. That was because prior to that, it was up to each new president to decide if they cared about cybersecurity at all and how elevated that cybersecurity person was. So we've had some cybersecurity czars before, but how much power they've had has been up to the individual president. ONCD is now a permanent Senate confirmed function that's permanently in the executive office of the president, and is meant to be a staying power and a stabilizing power across presidents being elected. So thus far, knock on wood, cyber remains a nonpartisan issue. There are certain issues that could easily pull them into partisan splits, but the ONCD is meant to be a more permanent institution that always has the same staff budget and influence, irrespective of who comes in. The head of that will be a political appointee. The first one was Chris Ingles, who was beloved by everybody, and it was part of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Currently, the acting ONCD is Kemba Walton, who is also very familiar to this and was his deputy. So that group and staff is meant to be a more permanent institution with the ability for Senate oversight and confirmation going forward. So that's one part of the answer. The other one is there's this thing called the Overton window, which is political will is a funny thing. It doesn't last forever. And this notion that it's currently bipartisan and bicameral, like House and Senate, both generally agree on these things, that won't last forever. So this, I think we see an Overton window proven by the Patch Act passing into law against heavy lobbying, and it's not going to stay open forever. These windows close. So of all the things we just talked about, obviously liability is very controversial and much less likely to pass in a House and Senate being split red and blue.
Well, and that's the bit that you bet would get sorted in the courts anyway, right?
Yeah, I do. I think it'll be in the courts, and so does a lot of the scholars here. Like Andrea Matwishin, if you've ever met her, she's been a law professor going to DEF CON for like 15 years or more. She wrote a legal brief called The Internet of Bodies, which I think I met her when I was researching Anonymous, but then we started collaborating as I was building up I Am the Cavalry after that. And the Internet of Bodies covers a lot of ground, but we kind of like compared notes and cross-referenced, but there's a lot of case law from the physical world of how we introduce liability into other things. And part of her legal brief is when you have the first court cases for loss of life, she wants this to be the source material that is pulled first from the legal journal, archives and whatnot. So in those, we've been talking before this strategy just helps because if there's an Internet of Bodies brief pulled by the judge and jury, and the clerks for that court case, that's one thing. But if they also reference, well, what's the White House's posture on this? They have clear documentation, and there will be implementation work streams, plural, coming out for many of these. I'm already being participating in some of them. They're just, each one has to double check and triple check the legal authorities to figure out how they're going to do these and how publicly they're going to do these. But my money's on, there'll be a judge and jury that says, hey, a loss of life due to a physical part failing shouldn't be no different than a loss of life from a software part failing. And this is how we make it the first case law on cyber liability. You could argue, and I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to try right now. And if you really want one, you should have her on the show. But there are a couple district courts or circuit courts that have already sort of introduced software liability, but not for cyber reasons. And part of, I think, this work stream is going to be a survey of what is the law at the federal level, what's the law at the circuit level, and case law and the relevant case law. But one you've heard from me before, if you've seen some of my RSA talks, I did one with Jake Kuhn in 2014. I think we called it software liability, the worst possible idea except for all others, is one of the key things that might calm down some of the people that are freaking out about open source. A lot of the language you'll see here uses the phrase final goods assembler. A lot of the stuff we use in the SBOM working groups is called final goods assembler. And that comes from a lawsuit at the turn of the century with McPherson. A family was suing Buick Oldsmobile for the losses of loved ones. And in it, basically the wooden wheels were collapsing, and there was a lawsuit about it. And the automaker said, that's not our fault, go sue Firestone, it's their wheels. And the judge and jury ruled in case law that as the final goods assembler, the one selling the product, you are in the best position to identify and eliminate risk in your supply chain. You're liable.
The buck stops.
The buck stops there. So, making an open source project does not make you liable for a coding error. There are certain obligations on the final goods assembler.
Well, there's going to be a difference between, like a software library that on its own is not a product, right? But if you're shipping an open source product that people are using, that might be different.
Yeah, and these are the debates and concerns that are going to have, and that's why it has to get hashed out. Yeah. But what they, I think it's important that they're introducing this. That you asked about Safe Harbor, so I'm not going to speak for them. But I've been floating publicly for many years now. Here's an example. In a world with liability, so right now when you say we want software transparency, we want you to be patchable, we want you to avoid known exploited vulnerabilities, in your code and your products, and maybe you should have an expectation of prompt and agile response when there are new ones discovered in your product. What is the shared responsibility? And in a world one where you basically say, we're selling you a product, it's none of your business what's in it, we're not going to offer you patches, tough crap, we made a risk decision, it's your problem. Then if there was harm, then the operator was in no position to know the risk they were taking on, no position to patch themselves, no position to make a formal risk acceptance. So if you snap your fingers in that world, then the producer of goods is going to have all the liability, 100%.
So if we're reading between the lines here, where we're not seeing open source in here, it's really kind of between the lines in pillar 3, where we're talking about the folks most capable of taking action here. Basically, they need to be supporting some open source.
It's depends on who you ask and where you draw the lines, but here's what I think is going to happen for a Safe Harbor. I think they're going to try liability on final goods assemblers, especially device makers in critical infrastructure or in public safety, human life areas. I think those are going to be commercially transacted final goods assembled. And I think a rubric, not the rubric, but the one I promulgated a lot, is if you make if you publish a software bill of materials at the time of sale and it's free of known exploited vulnerabilities, or you have a prompt and agile update available when you have them, maybe you would draw the line at known exploited vulnerabilities from CISA or something. Pick your favorite line. Then now you've taken that pure liability and you said, okay, our job is to tell you what's in it, make it free of obvious defects and neglect, and give you an update whenever you need to. If you fail to apply that update, that's on you. So now you've taken a single monolithic, the producer is always liable, down to what's the shared responsibility between the producers and maintainers of goods and those who own and operate them. And at least now you've split it in half. So I think something approaching safe harbor is going to identify the minimum standard acceptable practices from a producer of goods, and then if the operators fail to take that advice, or they take on acceptance of a formal risk, or they never apply the patches, then that will be somewhat of the safe harbor. So there's a bunch of legal scholars about to debate this very topic on Pillar 3, and legal scholars. There's a bunch of economists too, though. This is a pretty multidisciplinary issue. Economists basically tell you liability is very economic. Generally speaking, markets want to be efficient. And when you don't reveal true costs and you don't put the cost burden on the least cost avoider, you have an inefficient market, and we're spending money on things instead of buying new products and goods. So I think there'll be legal scholars that look at this. There'll be economic scholars that look at this. There'll be trade associations that fight this. And in the wash, you're going to figure out how much burden goes on the owners and operators, how much burden goes on the producers of goods, and how maybe we need to right size our investments in some common good public infrastructure like open source. But generally speaking, there shouldn't be huge surprises that we're looking for transparency, no known defects, and responsible behavior for things like maybe coordinated disclosure, patching, et cetera. So I don't know how it'll shake out, but I know I'd like to see it shake out, and I think there's a head start on some of the thinking.
Yeah, I'd love to see. You said,
go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just doing some research. And you said earlier that you felt that 9 years was long, before introducing an idea and then seeing a law, and then you referred to seat belts a couple times. Yeah. The law requiring seat belts here was passed in 1976. Yeah. The first car that was sold with seat belts was sold in 1949, right? So that's 27 years. So that's 3 times as long, right? So I think there's a lot of things that look long to us because that's like the third or a quarter of our entire careers.
Everything's getting shorter. Yeah.
But in the end, if you zoom out, it's actually pretty short. So that was my optimistic take of the day.
I fluctuate often on, was this really, really fast, or was it really, really slow? And one of the things I keep reminding us is that the very thing I said to start Eye on the Cavalry, August 1st, almost 10 years ago, was our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety, human life, economic and national security. So it's about the rate of change. So Semmelweis, not a long history lesson, but Semmelweis was the guy that said, hey, maybe you should wash your hands after you do an autopsy in the morgue before you deliver a baby or do a surgery.
Radical, unthinkable.
Radical. And we didn't believe in germs. You were crazy to believe in these invisible organisms. Like, he was ignored for about 100 years. And when people started scrubbing in, the survival rate for mothers post-childbirth went way up. He's the patron saint of motherhood. And
so what you're saying is in 2122, when someone is sick, wearing a mask in North America will be an accepted practice. That's very positive.
Okay. I was told when we started the cavalry, it's going to take 100 years. And I said, I don't want to wait 100 years. So against a 100-year scale, 9's pretty good for that one. But I do think
that means you can get 10 things done in 100 years, right? Like, so they got to be impactful things. Otherwise, things are going to change more than they get improved, in which case you're kind of losing ground. That's why I don't mind the content of the security strategy that much. I'm not against it. I'm not really for it. I'm just happy to see that something might happen, and then I'll reserve judgment for the end result. But I think it's positive that there's definitely focus on it, and there might start to be some actual movement towards improving things, which is interesting. And maybe some things are going to make no sense at all and will need to be changed. But I think that's to be expected whenever you're making significant changes. So that's why, I don't know why. I don't know how that will be implemented and when we're going to start seeing, results, like actual results in the field from that. I'm sure it's going to take a few years, but not like 5 or 10, more like 2, right?
We won't get all these done. But if you want some faith, or you want to gauge your own confidence level, Google the CSIS launch event for this and listening to the opening remarks from Kemba. Kemba's excited to do the implementation. She's going to define herself in her team's success for this inaugural ONCD by their implementation. And she uses incredibly refreshing language. Instead of this being like cyber war and cyber conflict and a lot of the cliches we use, she uses phrases like, this is a symphony, not a movement, right? Like this is a piece of a symphony. And the phrases, the metaphors, and the emotional intelligence with which she speaks is pretty new and pretty encouraging. And part of my confidence comes from seeing that they're already pretty far along on implementation of several of these, even if they haven't revealed that. And part of it is just it's in the context of that unprecedented political will that we saw starting with the Patch Act and moving forward into this year. My hesitation, if I'm pessimistic, is twofold. One is, will that window stay open forever? I don't think so. I think the bulk of the movement's going to happen this year while the window's still open. And number two is, without sounding alarmist and ending on a bad note, I started off by saying the political will that drove this is successful attacks on water, food, oil and gas, electricity, hospitals. So the attackers are becoming more brazen, and the impact and the consequences are becoming more severe. And we're seeing a lot more attacks on food supply. And that's just from criminals. But we've also got to, can't forget for a second that part of what drove this political will is that the hot war in Ukraine and Russia has already had some cyber retaliation in parts. And there's been pretty overt telegraphs that if you interfere with us on the battle space, or if we back into a corner, we're going to use cybersecurity to retaliate against anyone who interferes. So we have incredibly vulnerable and prone critical infrastructure that is right now having accidents and criminal actors kind of disrupt it. But if someone wanted to disrupt us more, they could quite easily do so. So I think this is part of the mix as to why there's political will, but this sentiment and the political will may be too little too late. And we might have to see it get worse before it gets better, because some of these initiatives will take years. Like in some cases for food, there's not even a dedicated food ISAC, period.
The best time to plant a tree was 40 years ago, right? Second best time is now. So I think with that optic, it's still better now than in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years.
Yeah. Well, my hope to listeners, though, is please don't. No one likes this, right? I worked in the government. I saw how wildly broken and ineffective it is. And it has a role to play because their job is to look out for everybody, not just for one company at a time or one enterprise.
It's ineffective by design, though, right? Like that's not necessarily always bad. It's also good when something that we don't want to see happen is not allowed to happen because there's that process, right? So I don't know if we can say it's completely broken.
But I'm not pro-government, pro-legislation, even if it sounds like it. What I am is that, and I think this is where the White House got as well, is we have to have a balanced share of responsibility between public good and private good, and it has been imbalanced. So this is not a revolution. It's meant to be a rebalancing, and we'll find the right sweet spot, but the current state is not sustainable. And I'm proud to see some willingness to acknowledge that. And now it's going to take open-mindedness and creativity. My challenge to anybody who reads this or hears this is look for what's right in these proposals and get them to focus on what's right to make it more right. There's plenty wrong, but this is a strategy, not a plan. The devil's going to be in the details on implementation, and you can either be throwing stones from afar or you can roll up your sleeves, lean in, and try to make the good parts better. And from what I've seen, the things that get traction is where you invest in making something better as opposed to tearing something down. There's a lot of will to do this, and I hope that you help improve it wherever you can.
How does one do that?
Sometimes writing, sometimes if someone asks you to get involved, getting involved. There'll be some public things and public comment periods for many of these. Anytime the federal government adds regulation, there has to be a public comment period. And so far, I've seen some of our friends be pretty hyperbolic, not even factual all the time in their hyperbole, but that's unlikely to get you invited to working groups. But
I think that was an opportunity for an I Am the Cavalry plug right there. That's what that was.
I'm never promoting groups or whatever. I'm promoting the mission. But yeah, I mean,
Right.
whatever your pet project is, if you really want to make sure this doesn't mess up open source, great. Get involved and say how we can do this really well in a way that preserves and strengthens open source, as opposed to saying this is going to kill open source.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think, kind of clarified for me when I was working at 451 and I had the luxury to kind of like big think things, and at the same time, I was talking to you a lot, Josh, and you had started I Am the Cavalry. One thing that I think became really clear is that there's a lot of critical stuff in security that the market, it's not so much that it can't fix it, it's that there's no money in doing so it won't.
Yeah.
Things like, like I remember looking at vulnerability management and thinking, well, somebody's eventually going to have to go through the 200,000 vulnerabilities, that we have in this, these massive commercial vulnerability databases and figure out which ones matter, because most of them don't,
Right.
And then when I saw the CISA create the known exploitable or known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, I was like, there it is, like that's, and that's got, I think 898 vulnerabilities in it right now.
Yeah, it's a very small
200,000. Right. And it's like the industry created the haystack and dumped it on the needles, and eventually.
But there's also
government volunteers. Somebody's got to dig it out.
From an industry point of view, there's also things that improved a lot since then, right? Like you mentioned, vulnerability scanners showing millions of vulnerabilities.
Right.
A thing that was 15 years ago, everyone was running these servers with, installed software and servers that would live for like 7 years between refreshes and all of that. And in some spaces, we are not doing that anymore, right? Like we're using managed cloud services and Lambdas and containers with really small attack surfaces. But I don't think that's happening. But at the same time, I don't think that's happening in like healthcare or in these other sectors that this is looking at, right? So I think some of us that work in tech, it's easy to forget how different things might be in an ICS environment, for example, that changes at a much slower pace, right? So there's some of these improvements that they haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah. Ephemeral infrastructure wasn't designed to help security, though. It was more of like a good luck side effect kind of thing that we'll take and enjoy.
Reducing complexity will improve security. Right now, is Kubernetes reducing complexity? Is an argument we could have for a few hours, but
well, everything's a bug and everything goes back to safety, right? Like a lot of security stuff, like maybe that is the better lens to look at a lot of this stuff through.
Yeah, and this is not the point I want to end on per se, but to Guillaume's point, Dr. Suzanne Schwartz, in the post-market guidance for FDA several years ago, she did something pretty stunning. She said, because she didn't have the right to regulate and require a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. But what she said was, in our post-market surveillance, if you have a coordinated disclosure program and you can identify and remediate your issue in 30 days, and you join an ISAO, then we might let you handle your disclosure, your fix on your own without regulatory action. So it was a big word salad, but basically what it said is, if you've got a disclosure program and a CI/CD pipeline and test regime that can identify and fix this in 30 to 60 days, you can handle this on your own. We won't fine you. We won't punish you. We won't do a safety communication. You can self-ordain. And that day, when she first introduced the 30-day thing, everybody in the room lost it. And they're like, oh my God, it takes us 90 days to do our QA cycle. We could never do this. And at the dinner that night, I said, hey guys, what would have to be true? I said, Microsoft does nightly full regression tests on all their code. Like, what would have to be true for you to hit this incentive?
Do you think that's still true, by the way?
I have no idea anymore. But I talked to some of the biggest medical device makers, and I said, what would have to be true for you to take advantage of this offer? Because it's not a requirement, it's an offer. And he's like, well, I guess we could do this and do this. I said, well, why don't we do more automation? How could you tighten your pipeline? And one of the biggest ones went and talked to like Gene Kim and got Phoenix Project for Everybody and Kevin Bear and started introducing CI/CD DevOps principles into medical device pipeline. And they got it down to 15 days. But they went from 90 days to 15 days. And they just never had the question or thought to do so. So I think part of the idea of holding some of these ICS and embedded systems and cyber physical systems accountable to the pace and rate of threat and attack surface, is asking them, do we really need to do it the old way, or can we modernize and do things? Where can we use ephemeral? Where can we use distributed? The DIE principles, maybe nowhere, but maybe in some spots. And the overarching reaction I've seen to much of this pressure we put on medical devices is complexity reduction. Like, what's our elective complexity, elective code blow, elective attack surface, elective features? And it's not always putting something into the product that makes it safer. It's taking things out of the product that makes it safer. And I'm not saying we're where we need to be, but this is the first time I saw a White House or congressional acknowledgement that it's not always a technology problem. It's sometimes an incentive problem. They want to fund new ideas and reference architectures. They want to maybe shift financial burden and liability to those who are the best position to absorb it. And we already have liability and harm. It's just currently almost always on the owners, operators, or victims. And I don't think we're going to solve it because they wrote a strategy. But I think the strategy is an important step to ask us to then do the implementation, have the debates, and hopefully people will bring debates in good faith and get us to a better balance point.
Well, that sounds like a great place to wrap. I don't know if you agree, Josh. I can give you a little bit more if you've got another point you want to wrap on. But that's, I mean, it does seem pretty hopeful to me. It does seem like we finally have some traction, whereas 10 years ago it felt like yelling into the void. But it's been awesome having this conversation. Anything else before we wrap it up?
No, I just said it before, but I'll just say it one last time. This is uncomfortable. I have a lot of reasons why I could attack this, but Overton's windows are rare and short. And if we're going to improve the balance and shared responsibility, if we're going to find ways to make a big leap forward on complexity reduction or get rid of really reckless and dangerous IT and technical infrastructure, this is the chance to do it. So don't blow it. Make good choices, figure out what's right with it, lean in, and try to help make it better. Because it's not a spectator sport, right? We've been trying to argue for positive things for a very long time, and this is one of your finite windows to do so.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Josh, for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. And we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.